Brazil is actually a more urbanized country than the US right now. And that brings with it some enormous upsides. We're all keenly aware of the great pleasures of Rio and of the economic engine that Sao Paulo has been at various points in time. But there are also, of course, downsides of density. When people are close to each other, there are numerous what economists call negative externalities that occur when we're close to each other. And that in some sense requires a strong public sector to manage those negative externalities, which include traffic congestion, contagious disease, pollution of the water, and so forth. How do you think the great cities of Brazil are doing on managing these negative externalities, and how do you think they can do better?
In Brazil, we have a saying, if there is, it's about jabuticabas, which is a specific Brazilian fruit. It's like grapes, like a round grape. And we say, if we have in Brazil, and it's not jabuticaba, then it's a bad thing. Okay? And in Brazil, most of these bad things are related with these coordination problems, negative externality problems that you mentioned, many of which are related to the growth of big cities. Not only that, high inflation, high inequality, which is within cities but around, but like you say, traffic jams, sewerage, for example, or crime, are problems which are worse in Brazil than in countries with comparable GDPs, etc. So when you mention these big urban problems, we are talking about the parts of where Brazil didn't really develop as much. These coordination problems, and I think they are governance problems. So, for example, if you get the case of sewage, access to sewage is much worse than water, light, even trash collection. Why? I think in some sense it's related to the point you mentioned on externalities. Like if I don't have water or light in my house, I have a problem. If I don't have access to sewage, treatment of sewage, everyone has a problem. So you have a problem. So it's this sort of dynamics, but not only related to that. Like it's relationship type of problem. Crime is a relationship. Inequality reflects the relationship. I can say someone is poor or non-poor, talk about the individual, but inequality is a characteristic of the relationship between people. And I think today Brazil lives a very deep relationship problem. It's gone worse because it's related somewhat with the crisis of the Brazilian state. So Brazil, we do have a big government, either federal government or in terms of cities, a lot of taxes, but not very effective. And I think this is the main issue Brazil is addressing today.
So cities attract both rich and poor people. Rio, of course, has attracted poor people by the hundreds of thousands for decades and even centuries. Of course, some of those poor people came here in chains, but often they come because there are better opportunities. But they also create enormous challenges. And the huge inequality that's true in Brazilian society, as is true in American society, becomes visible, becomes really tangible and tactile in Brazil, where you can see the same view, you can see the apartments of Ipanema, and you can see a favela in the same. I mean, it's sort of an amazing thing.
I think as you capture precisely, Rio, is the divided city. That's our nickname. For example, São Paulo and Brasilia, you can call surrounded cities. The poor areas are on the outskirts. Rio is different because inequality, which is very high, is higher than inequality in the city of Rio than the inequality levels, let's say Gini, in the whole country. So, but in more than that, it's visible to the naked eye. So it creates more like these externalities, and rich and poor people living side by side generates, violence and, drug problems, etc.
How do you think about making Sao Paulo more beautiful as well as more democratic?
Yeah, it's interesting because São Paulo is Rio upside down, right? In Rio, you have the beach, the water, and the lagoon and other things, and all the rich people are living near the water, and the poor people live in the hills, right? There are some plain favelas as well, but mostly in the hills. São Paulo, no. You have the rivers in the bottom, and the rich people live in the top because they wanted to avoid the floods. And I think to make São Paulo more beautiful, and I would say even more than beautiful, livable, and taking beauty as something that makes things more effective. First thing we have to do, we have to recover the rivers of the city. São Paulo is full of rivers and affluents that have been taken over by concrete, and that generate a lot of the problems with the floods and the quality of the water and the lack of like open spaces, also in the quality of the air. So this is really key. And after that, and using nature as a vector of integration for mobility, for public equipments, for everything, like how can we also make the city greener? Because the amount of vehicles here is immense, you know, like in the last 10 years, Brazil grew 11% its population, but the car fleet grew 113%.
The difference, I would say, between Sao Paulo and the North American examples is that in the case of Sao Paulo, you actually have an extremely affluent hypercenter, not just the center, but what's defined as the inner core of the city, and then a belt of significant poverty along the edges, which means that commuting times into the city range between 2 and 4 hours one way a day.
I would say that we are just in the middle of this conflict. There is a clear trend and a clear use of the space with all the conflicts that means, like skate rollers, bike laners, sidewalkers, and all these kind of things. Living in a city where the planification was totally focused on the car use.
I think there are 3 key components that then, of course, nest many others, right? But the first one is rethinking mobility infrastructure. Primarily the overlap between mass transit and its different scales and modalities, right? Metro, heavy rail, BRT, all the way to sort of informal buses and et cetera, bikes, et cetera. The second one has to do with rethinking, a very important project for Sao Paulo, which is rethinking the scale of its mobility infrastructure in relationship to its urban grid, right? Sao Paulo is a city that relies heavily on very large, big conduits. And it might be interesting for Sao Paulo, as many other cities are doing, to rethink the way that these conduits can actually become more distributive in relationship to a grid system.
Mm-hmm. So smaller roads, smaller rail lines relative to massive...
Right. And smaller roads, but more, right? Because if you have one big road, if you have a clog in that road, everything gets clogged. If you have a grid like Manhattan, for example, right? If something happens in one avenue, you have 6 or 7 that can actually help you move traffic. And I think many cities are moving away into that model. And I think the third one has to do with rethinking the right scale between urban blocks, right, that are desirable for real estate developers, for the market, but that also address the desires of what actually makes a residential community.